11:30.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This presentation is a little bit shorter than the audit one that I went through, and then we have lunch after this break. So I'll try not to hold lunch off for too long. This presentation is going to go over just some compliance type issues, that just the guidelines you need to follow and some of the things that you should be aware of that you should be following. Again, our contact information, most important slide. I hope you took a screenshot of this or have a copy of this presentation from our website. So what do you have to follow? What rules are out there where we could potentially write you up if you don't follow it? If you receive federal funds, depending on what program, what agency gave you that, there's different rules for each one. And I linked there in yellow, it's really small. Unless you're actually participating in a federal grant, I don't recommend you go to the Code of Federal Regulations, to the CFR. Sometimes it's even hard for me to search through that and find what I want. So if you do have any issues looking through that and you need something, you can contact us. So after the federal regulations, there's state statutes. There is section on local government, sections all throughout, township assistance. There's a specific township trustee section, and many sections. And I'll go over later how to search for a state statute. And then you also have to follow local policies and resolutions. So if you make a rule locally, make sure you're following your own rule, because I've seen it where we've written people up for not following their own policies. And sometimes it's the result of you just not updating that timely, or just knowing about it if you're a new trustee. So just make sure you understand what you should be following, what's been passed in the past. Like maybe you could look at board minutes to see what resolutions have been passed. But for our material, it's all on our website. We have the township manual, we have the township bulletins. Those hold the same weight, they just aren't combined. We haven't been updating them as frequently as we want to, and I'll get to that. But we also have the regulatory manual, which is essentially us telling you how the financial statement should be presented and other things. But our macro and the gateway reporting process takes care of a lot of that. We have the internal control manual. We have a separate page on our website, a training video about internal controls. And then we have the IT manual. And that discusses, like, if you have computer systems, how to back up your data, do not share passwords, and things like that in it. And then we also have state examiner directives, where Paul, he could issue a directive, just like the monthly uploads. So the monthly uploads, that's a requirement through a directive. I think it's 2018-1, or it's one of the directives on the website where he required monthly uploads to happen so we could audit remotely. So that's also something the local units have to follow as well. So if you've called into our office and you've gotten Jonathan, I'm most likely working on another project. A lot of my time has been working on this searchable database, and it's going to be like a future searchable library online, where it's going to include all the manuals, bulletins, directives, presentations, common Indiana codes, like FAQs that people submit to us and we post online. All of that is going to be on a searchable database where you can search for answers, you can look up statutes, all in one place. And everyone, or most people here, know that our township manual hasn't been updated since 2010, and it's really out of date. It still has the dog fund in it, which that statute's been repealed. So when I am moving all of this data to the database, when I get to the township manual, which should be very soon, we'll be updating that. And then we will let you know when the township manual is updated. And then shortly after that, we should announce the release of our database. So I look forward to that. Just to let you know that something is coming. And now I'm going to go over some audit positions we have each year, depending on legislative changes we have, maybe even changes of opinion in our office over time. Maybe one thing made sense, but now it doesn't quite make sense anymore. We come out with these audit opinions and we put them in our bulletins or our manuals, and then you need to follow those. So I'm just going to go over a couple examples of some opinions that affect townships from us. So this isn't necessarily new, but it is a good thing to remember because we get questions about it. So for like township telephone and internet reimbursement, our prior position was that if you have an office in your home and you want to be reimbursed for the telephone or internet, you could be reimbursed up to 50% of that. And we thought about that position and we said, well, that's kind of an arbitrary percentage. I understand 50% is half, but we should let the local units decide what they want to do and what is best for their township. So whatever you, the trustee and the board decides, they can come up with a policy and we will audit to that policy. So after October of 2017, you're allowed to come up with a policy. And if you want 100% of that cost to be reimbursed to the township, you can do that. But again, you should be thinking about what is actually being used for township business and base that policy upon that. So whatever your policy says, that's what we'll audit to, and we won't take exception. Renting an office. This is under the same statute that the telephone and internet kind of is in. I pasted it there at the bottom, but it does say in the statute that the board needs to determine what reasonable is for rent expenses. So if you are renting an office, to get reimbursement for that, you need a policy. The board needs to note in that policy what's reasonable. And some issues we've seen in the past is that other employees are receiving rent reimbursements. Only the trustee in the statute, I highlighted it there, the township executive, only the trustee can receive rent reimbursements. So if your wife or your husband or a family member living in your house is like your deputy or your clerk, they should not be receiving that, and it should only be going to the trustee. We have questions about nepotism, and this isn't an opinion per se. This is more just here's a statute, but we do get a bunch of questions about it, so I wanted to touch on it. The statute that I posted at the top here, it says that you can't have employees in your direct line of supervision, so that are relatives. So what that means is, like, if you wanted to hire a family member to work in the township, then you could do that. They just can't be in your direct line of supervision. And I know a lot of townships are smaller and that's really hard to avoid, so I'd recommend just not doing it. But you could have a larger township where they could work for a different department in the township where the trustee doesn't have a say over their daily duties, tells them how to do their job. They just aren't supervising them directly. So that would be okay. You just can't be in that direct line of supervision. There is a specific provision for townships where if your office is in your home, you can hire a family member as an employee. There's just the stipulation that they cannot receive more than $5,000 in compensation. And these laws went into effect in 2012, so you could be grandfathered in if you and your family member have worked for the township before 2012 and you've maintained continuous employment, then you may be grandfathered in and not have to follow those. But again, here are the statutes, and I'd recommend that you get with your attorney if you do have any questions about that. So talking about nepotism, just wanted to clarify that the nepotism policy and contracting with a unit policy are policies that are required by statute, so something you have to have. They could be separate documents. You can put them in one document if you want, but what both of these are trying to address is, the first one is hiring a family member, and then the second one is contracting with a family member, like to do mowing or work for the township. It doesn't say that it's not allowed, you just have to have a policy on it, and you need to be following your policy. So whatever you and your board decide, you need to have those policies, and then within those statutes, it kind of seems redundant, but it requires you and the board to certify that you're still following those policies. So technically, there should be in a meeting once a year. You can do it at the end of the year, whenever you want, I believe, and just document that you are all following your policies. One position we have about donations is that public funds, they can't be donated. You can't just give taxpayer money to another organization or an individual. There's processes in place for that. Certain funds like Township Assistance Fund, etc. But if you would like to give some funds to an organization to help your township, there is an avenue to do so. There is the Community Service Statute. That's Indiana Code 36648. And in that statute, it says that to be able to give an organization money for a service, funds need to be appropriated on a community service line. And if you have that in your budget and you have a line for community service, then you get past that hurdle. And then it also says the service that you want, it can't be provided by another government unit. So you can't, for example, decide to give a school money to transport students. They receive a tax levy for that. It used to be Transportation Fund, now it's called their Operations Fund. But they're supposed to be providing transportation for their students. So that's a service they're supposed to be doing. You shouldn't be giving them money to do that. But once you pass those two hurdles, then as long as you have a contract, we call it a community service contract, get with the entity you want to give money to and have it, I'm not a lawyer, but have it read in such a way where you are giving them funds for a service and they'll be providing that service to your township citizens. And since we just talked about the community service line item that you need, if you want to go under that statute, there is an avenue to transfer appropriations if you need to. Like, for example, if you don't have that community service line, you can transfer from an unused line to a new community service line. There is just some requirements in our chapter 4 of our township manual about this, where if you want to transfer appropriations, and just to be clear, this is not transferring between funds, this is not transferring money between funds on your ledger, this is just your budget. So if you want to transfer between appropriation lines, you can do it within the same fund and within the same budget category. The trustee can just unilaterally do that themselves. If you want to go between major budget classifications, and for example, like salaries and supplies, totally two different things and two different budget sections. If you want to transfer between those two, then you would need township board approval to do that. We have a bulletin for credit cards and debit cards, but I have highlighted the main points on these next two slides. And for you to even have a credit card or a debit card, you need to go through these steps. And you can find our bulletin online, but generally what our bulletin is requiring you to do is that your board needs to authorize the credit card through a resolution and note that it's approved in the minutes. And then you need to have a credit card policy, and in your credit card policy, you should document who has access, who can use that card, and have you and your board decide what the card could be used for. If you only want to use it for gas, maybe you have a card out there that gives you 5% back for cash or gas. So if you only want it to be used for gas, put that in the resolution and then that should be followed. But when you do use the card or issue it to an employee who can use the card, then it needs to be returned to the custody of whatever responsible person, most likely the trustee. So there should be some checkout list or tracking mechanism where you can know where that card is at all times. So I kind of just discussed that accounting log. I know more detail here, like the date that is checked out and expected to be returned, estimated amounts to be charged. That'd be a good thing to include. So credit cards should not be used to bypass the accounting system. You shouldn't just go out and use the credit card at a bunch of locations and then just put a lump sum entry into the records and then pay based upon the statement, the credit card statement. Each transaction that you make with the card, each charge at each location, you'll get a receipt just like you would if you're paying cash, but that transaction needs to be included in the records. So you should still have all that detail in your accounting system. And in the documentation that you keep needs to be related to each of those individual transactions and not just on the credit card statement itself, if that makes sense. So those are the requirements that we go over in our bulletin article to have a credit card. And we do note that if your board authorizes it, then you can pay a fee. We won't take exception to you paying a fee if your credit card issuer charges a fee to use the card. One position that I'm not sure is documented in a bulletin, it's just kind of been what we've been providing via email, where it deals with reconciling items. And if you need to make a correction in your ledger, where if you do your monthly reconcilement and you notice a difference where there's more in the bank than there is on your books, we recommend that you do your reconcilement, you have that difference as a reconciling item, and you just carry that difference forward. So if you do that over a period of months, you can see that maybe, for example, a $10 difference, you're carrying that forward and it's consistent. You know that it's not changing, and you can identify that it's consistent. So once you meet that criteria, you know the difference isn't changing every month and there's not other issues. It's really just that reconciling item you need to address. As long as it's immaterial, please review your materiality policy. I'll go over that later. You should have a threshold in there. As long as it's immaterial, below that amount, then you can make an adjustment in your ledger. Just document everything you're doing so our auditors can understand what you did. Another position in our manual, it talks about advance payments, and it says that you cannot pay for goods or services in advance. We know that this is sometimes hard to avoid and sometimes impossible to avoid, where we do have a position if it's a normal industry practice, and as long as you have internal controls implemented where if you do pay someone in advance, you have controls in place where you know you'll get your money back if you don't get the goods or services. Like, for example, airline tickets. You can't buy airline tickets without paying in advance. So that's a normal industry practice. We won't take exception and write you up for that. You should just try to avoid that whenever you can. This rule is really just to save government units money and not accidentally pay for something that they want to get. First presentation, I went over forms and that we have to make these forms. And just to be clear, we do not provide our forms directly. We don't have the staff or the infrastructure to do that. I'd like to in the future, but we'll see. So you need to get your forms from a public printer. And I know Boyce is out there. They're one of the bigger ones. We do have a list of public printers. If you want that list, you can email us and our front desk can get that to you. But in Chapter 3 of the manual, we list all the forms that we approve. So there may be other forms out there that you can use for all government units. So it may not be in the Chapter 3, but we still approved it and you can use it. It's depending on what you're using the form for. So that includes your ledger, your check that you use every time. And we have a appendix at the end of that manual where you can view the actual pictures of the forms. Yes, so on the next slide, I talk about prescribed forms. And if you don't want to purchase it, if it costs too much money or you just don't like the way the paper form looks or feels, then you can create your own form. It would need to be an exact replica of our forms. And if you change anything on it, then it wouldn't be an exact replica. So if you want to change it, we do have a form approval process. I linked the bulletin article below. It goes through I'm just going to summarize it for you. It's somewhat lengthy, I think a couple pages long, but Jonathan may have mentioned this earlier, that if you change the form, it needs to have the same function and it needs to collect the same information. So if our form has 10 fields of information you need to collect, your new form still needs to collect at least that amount. You can add more, but you still need to collect that information. For the function part of it, if a form has 2 approval areas, then your new form you create needs to at least still have that capability. Whether if you put it into your computer system as like an electronic form, in your system there still needs to be a place where you can have 2 approval processes. So if you have questions on that, you can look at our bulletin article, it has more detail there. And then once you go through that and make your own form, change a form, please put them on a list. And then when we come into audit, you can provide the list to the auditors and we can approve the form at that time. So that was the first half of this compliance presentation, just going over our positions and some of the things that have been in our bulletins that you may not be aware about. The second half is more on compliance, some statutes, things out there that you need to be aware of, not coming from us really, but it's just out there. And some of this may mesh with my first presentation of common findings. So I'll try not to spend too much time on those, but just to let you know, it is a prevalent issue. This one is just letting you know that the mileage rate increased. We get questions about the mileage rate, and it's always on the Department of Administration's IDOA, their website. So I posted their website there, but effective March 1st, it went from 38 cents to 39 cents a mile. And then the state lodging rate is $96 a night, with additional increases in certain areas. I think Marion County and maybe some other places. The capital project plan, DLGF has been taking the head on this, like answering questions, putting out memos and trainings and things like that. So really they should be the ones probably answering your questions on this if you have more in-depth questions, but if you weren't aware about it, I just wanted to let you know. Because a statute was passed where if you do not have a capital project plan and you meet the criteria where you're supposed to have it, then they could make it so you don't receive any tax funds until you do, which that's a big issue if you need to provide services to your citizens. So you must adopt a capital project plan if you meet 2 criteria. The first one is all of your capital improvement funds being $200,000, and then all your capital improvement funds are 150% of your budget. So if you meet those 2 criteria, you need a capital project plan. And for townships, it's almost everything you have. Everything you have is almost considered a capital improvement fund. So if your fund could be used on capital like expenditures like a fire truck, a building, land, the things that Jonathan mentioned in the capital asset portion of this presentation, then it would be considered capital improvement funds. So for townships, that would include the township fund, fire cume, the fire fund, fire building equipment fund, park and rec fund, etc. So if you can use it on capital-like items, then it's included in that calculation. I already talked about the bonds. Some things I didn't mention earlier. It needs to be payable to the state of Indiana, not to the State Board of Accounts. Please don't list us on your bond. It needs to be approved by the county auditor and then filed with the county recorder within 10 days of issuance. So, and then I mentioned this verbally earlier, but I put the actual statute here where each $1 million receipts, you need $30,000 more of coverage, at least. So there's a statute for you. Bank accounts, they need to be located in the township per that statute. If you don't have a bank in your township, you can go to the surrounding townships and then the county if there are not banks in the surrounding townships as well. And there's a process. of how to search for a bank in that statute, but it needs to be located in the township if you have one. If you make electronic payments and you do electronic banking, there is also a statute that addresses that. And you need to have the board pass a resolution and allow the township to do or participate in electronic payments. I pasted the statute here as well. If you have questions, you can reach out. But for going back to the bank accounts, the treasurer of state, they have a list of approved depositories. So part of the treasurer of state's responsibilities is to approve banks or depositories in the state. So just make sure your bank is on that list. And I linked their website below. We get questions on allowable investments, and those are identified in that statute, Indiana Code 5-13-9. And really, you should only be investing in things that are in that statute. And it is restricted to more of the less risky type of investments, like mutual funds, CDs, certificates of deposit, and things like that. Don't invest in stocks. Don't invest in anything that's not defined in that statute. One point of order, I guess, whatever you invest in, it needs to be held at your bank or designated depository. You should not, for example, directly invest in JP Morgan because they're not a bank. Chase Bank is Chase Bank. So if you send your money to JP Morgan needs to send your investment to your designated depository, and it needs to be held in that bank. We have a bulletin article on that. If you have any questions, let me know. We get a lot of questions about advertising, and maybe the better person to answer those sort of questions is the public access counselor, and I pasted their website there below. And so I pasted the open door law up at the top. I'm definitely not an open door law expert, but what I am aware of is that for public meetings, you need to have a 48-hour notice, so putting up like a sign or an advertisement. And then in the statutes, they have specific times you have to advertise. So this kind of advertisement would be in the paper. So it lists elections 10 days in advance. Sales of bonds, you need to advertise 15 days in advance and then 3 days before the sale. If you receive bids on something, you need to advertise twice. So at least 1 week apart and then at least 7 days before you receive it. And then if you establish a cumulative or sinking fund, you need to advertise that twice, at least 1 week apart and then 3 days before the hearing. So those are specifically mentioned, and also the annual financial report is specifically mentioned. So that, the way it's worded is just odd the way it is, but it's 4 weeks after the third Tuesday following the third Monday in February. So based upon how the calendar is each year, that it'll be a floating date of when that will be due to be advertised, but we will put that in our bulletin. So follow our bulletins. We have dates in there and we'll include that information. If you have any budget information you're dealing with, please refer to the DLGF budget tax rate calendar. If Indiana Code 5313 is not mentioned, then the way I understand it is the 10-day requirement falls in for the advertising of any other meetings that require publishing in the paper. But anything beyond that is outside of probably my knowledge base, so please reach out to the public access counselor, or you can email us and we can do some research if you have another question. Looks like I'm going into lunchtime here. Only have a couple slides left, I think, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. I apologize if you don't catch a lot of the stuff, but you can always email questions. A lot of questions on the rainy day fund. I've listed here the funds that you're allowed to transfer to the rainy day. And the reason that some funds you cannot transfer to the rainy day fund is because they're restricted to a certain purpose. Because the rainy day fund you can use for whatever you decide they can be used for. It just needs to be in the resolution that set up the rainy day fund. And in that statute, your transfers to rainy day, they cannot be over 10% of your total budget. If you want to work for another unit, there's a Lucrative Office dual office holding guide by the Attorney General that I linked here. If a board member wants to become an employee, you can't be an elected official and an employee of the same unit. So if an employee wants to be a board member, they'd have to stop being an employee to be a board member. Here's some policies that you may need to think about, where if you give your employees benefits, you're going to need an employee benefit policy. I talked about a bunch of these other ones that are required by statute, but if you have any questions on these, just let us know. Internal controls, I hope you've all adopted the minimum standards by now, which is the Board of Accounts Internal Control Manual. You need to do the training on our website just one time, and you only need to do the internal control training if you have access to public funds. So your board members don't need to do it. It's recommended that they do, but they don't have to if they don't have access to public funds. And then after you do all that, you need to have your own policies that go over what you're doing for the internal controls for your unit. Here's some sites on the website for internal controls. If you really want to go to sleep at night, you can read that Federal Green Book. But there is a lot of information here, and we do have a YouTube video, like I said earlier. If you want to look up some state statutes, like I mentioned earlier, you can go to the General Assembly website, and I pasted their link below in the top right hand corner. I may go over this later at the end of the day. If you type in the code numbers, it will bring you right to that code. But we can show you how to do that later. And I'll also go over our website for those who's not familiar with it to show you what's on our website. Are there any questions, Jonathan?
I do have a few. If we raise our capital asset threshold from 500 to 5,000, is that going to cause an issue with the audit as long as it is internally documented what is dropped off the list? That's what I would recommend, is maintaining a file with those items on it and then show what items were removed from that capital asset ledger and maintain them for audit documentation. Is $5,000 limit on family members in office in your home, is that gross or net? That would be the gross amount. And then we've had a couple questions on whether the Township Capital Improvement Plan has been pushed back to September of 2021. I think we're doing some research on that to try and determine that answer, and hopefully I'll be able to get that answer before the end of the day. If not, we'll send something out. And then we have one question regarding the capital project plan. It said the slide showed 1.15% of annual budget, but he thought you heard you say 1.5%.
For what?
Regarding the project plan, how much? Oh,
150% of the budget.
It's 150% of the annual budget. So, I think I stayed up on top of the other questions. They were coming in very quickly. So if there's not, you can always email us at our email address if we don't get to one of your questions today, and we will get back with you as soon as we can.
Yep. So we'll continue to answer questions in the chat. We're going to mute ourselves so you don't hear us eating our lunch. So feel free to take lunch, and we'll be back here at 12:30 to do our two last presentations.